Welcome to you all. On ouvre la séance.
The meeting will now begin.
Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 12
Welcome to the 12th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Section 108.2 and the motion adopted by the Subcommittee on Monday, October 28, 2025, the Subcommittee will meet as part of its study on internally and externally displaced people across the world. Today's meeting is a hybrid meeting, and according to the regulations, members can participate in person or via Zoom.
for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. J'aimerais maintenant souhaiter la bienvenue à
I would
notre
now like to welcome our first witness,
Senior Advisor to Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Corina Machado by video conference. I would like to mention to the committee that Mr. Smolensky did not go through the process of testing, but it seems to be no flag from the interpretation, though we could welcome him. And would like to welcome also Dr. Einat Wilf, author and teacher of Zionism by video conference. From Climate Refugees, Amalie Tower, founder and executive director by video conference. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, Canada, Dr. Kausar Ahmed, executive director and adjunct professor by video conference. From International Organization for Migration, and Catherine Schaefer, Deputy Director, Department of Humanitarian Response and Recovery. From Observatory on International Migration, Refugees, Stateless Person and Asylum, Ndei Dienaba Ndia, Founder, Professor of Law. Welcome to you all. I would like to give each of you 5 minutes introduction, and I insist, please try to respect the time due to the numbers of witnesses. I would like to invite Mr. David Smolensky to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, distinguished members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to be invited to the Parliament of Canada to testify about internally and externally displaced people around the world. According to the United Nations, approximately 123 million people have been forcibly displaced. From South Sudan to Haiti, we witness every year people fleeing their villages, towns, cities, and nations due to war, repression, and natural disasters. In my case, I come before you as a witness to what is now the largest migration and refugee outflow in the world, Venezuela. The United Nations estimate that nearly 8 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee our homeland. Civil society organizations suggest the number may be closer to 9 million. If Venezuelan migrants were a country, we will be roughly the size of Portugal, or twice the size of Panama or Croatia. This outflow has not been caused by a war or a natural disaster. It is the direct result of a brutal dictatorship responsible over the past decade for at least 20,000 arbitrary detentions, 18,000 extrajudicial killings, and more than 2,000 documented cases of torture. Venezuelans have fled a country where food, medicine, and basic goods have collapsed. It is estimated that 7.3 million people in my country cannot eat 3 times a day. Humanitarian conditions can be compared with nations like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Yemen. Between 2022 and 2024, more than 670,000 Venezuelans crossed the Darien Gap in Panama, a 10-day journey through extreme weather, criminal groups, and human traffickers. Millions have walked from Venezuela's border with Colombia to Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. To put this into Canadian perspective, that distance is comparable to walking from Vancouver to Toronto. How severe must conditions be for thousands of mothers to walk that distance carrying their children in their arms? How desperate must a population be to cross nearly an entire continent simply to survive? The lesson Venezuela teaches the world is clear. War and natural disasters are not the only drivers of mass displacement. When democracy collapses, when liberties are stripped away, and when access to justice disappears, a country can lose its population, even at levels greater than caused by armed conflicts or earthquakes. Today, approximately 2.3 million have fled South Sudan, nearly 7 million have fled Ukraine since Russia's invasion, and a similar number fled Syria during its civil war. More Venezuelans have fled their country than Syrians or Ukrainians. The regional impact has been enormous. The vast majority of Venezuelans migrants have been received by Latin American countries that have shown remarkable generosity. However, infrastructure, public services, healthcare, and education systems are under strain. This is the largest migration outflow in Latin American history, and its consequences are still unfolding. Moreover, the regime that relies on repression and illicit economic activities to remain in power has allowed organized criminal groups to expand beyond our borders. One example is Tren de Aragua, which has been designated as a terrorist entity in Canada. This organization has expanded its operation in at least 9 countries across the Americas, engaging motor, extortion, and human smuggling. But let me be absolutely clear. The vast majority of Venezuelan migrants are honest and hardworking people. We are the first to demand that members of that criminal organization and others face justice. These groups were also a source of insecurity that forced many Venezuelans to flee. It is essential not to generalize. A few criminals must not overshadow the sacrifice and dignity of millions. I would also like to address the current situation inside Venezuela. Since the July 28, 2024 presidential elections, at least 600,000 additional Venezuelans have fled the country, the largest outflow directly linked to political repression. Poll watchers, volunteers, and opposition members were threatened and persecuted. As the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has stated, Venezuelans are living under a state of terrorism.
If you could wrap that out, please, time is almost out.
Sure. Despite this, the hope has returned for millions of Venezuela under the leadership of President-elect Edmundo González and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Corina Machado. Many felt renewed optimism following the January 3rd military operation in Venezuela that ended with the capture of Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores. However, and I will end with this, protection remains essential. The Speaker of the Legitimate National Assembly, Jorge Rodriguez, has stated that Venezuelans under asylum or refugee status would not qualify for the regime's so-called amnesty. The international community will understand that the only sustainable way to stop forced displacement from Venezuela and encourage millions to go back is the full restoration of democracy and freedom. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Einat Wilf to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. What I would like to do today is to raise a very, very strong red flag at the possibility of mass displacement of Jews around the world as a result of rising anti-Zionism. One of the things that we've known, as I'm sure you know, the history going back to the Israelites, the Hebrews, the Judeans. We have a long history of mass displacement of the Jewish people that comes not from war, not from problems of starvation, but actually from ideology. The case of Jewish displacement often or frequently follows ideology. Since World War II, which is when most people know, the largest displacement of Jews has happened in the Arab world, where nearly 1 million Jews have been forced against their will outside of Arab countries from Morocco to Afghanistan, ending the existence of Jewish communities that predated the Arab and Islamic conquests of the Levant and North Africa. There has been mass displacement of Jews from Iran with the rise of the Shah, with the rise of the Islamic Republic. There has been mass displacement of Jews from the Soviet Union and from Eastern Europe. All of these displacements have taken part under the ideology of anti-Zionism. All these places have claimed in real time to have nothing against Jews, to only be against Zionists, but that was merely the kind of the respectable, updated way to push out Jews once anti-Semitism in its 19th and 20th century racialized form has been discredited by the Holocaust and World War II. So the replacement created by the Soviet Union after World War II has allowed the Arab world, Iran, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe to displace en masse millions of Jews, to strip them of their dignity, their homes, their assets, and essentially engage in one of the lesser known and mass acts of ethnic cleansing of Jews after World War II from the Arab world, the Islamic world, and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We are now seeing the rise of anti-Zionism and its insertion to the West. We see it rise in Canada, in the US, in Europe, in Australia. And I want to raise the red flag to say the following. Everywhere in the world, you will find no exception. Wherever anti-Zionism was allowed to become a dominant, respectable institutional ideology, two things happened. The first is the environment turned hostile to Jewish life, both individually and collectively, even as those countries claimed, as Canada claims today, to love Jews and have nothing against Jews, only against Zionists. And what happened next is that the Jews were gone because the playbook everywhere in the world, from the Arab world to Iran to the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe, was that first they claimed to have nothing against Jews, but as they demonized and criminalized Zionism, which I know Canada is now planning to do under the guise of anti-Palestinian racism, wherever Zionism was demonized, criminalized, ultimately Jewish life became impossible and Jews had to flee. So I'm using this testimony to take the long history of Jewish displacement to raise the flag that if you allow anti-Zionism to become institutionalized, legislated, respectable in Canada, your Jewish community will be gone.
Thank you, Dr. Wilf. And now I would like to invite Madame Amalie Tower to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, and thank you to the committee for this kind invitation. Last year, 117 million people were globally displaced. This year, that number is expected to rise by 6.7 million to 130 million people displaced due to conflict, climate change, declining funding, and major policy shifts. This is forecast amidst declining foreign assistance. More than 30% of humanitarian funding has disappeared over the past 2 years. This has severely impacted migration, asylum, and refugee protection systems in refugee host countries. Overseas development assistance is reducing by $62 billion this year. We generally think of human displacement as happening to people far from our borders. At a time when global displacement and anti-migration policies are on the rise, Canada can take measures to help people in its immediate vicinity right now. When the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in 2021, I was called to help evacuate thousands of Afghans. Now resettled Afghan refugees in the United States are being targeted for removal. Canada can protect Afghan refugees, a majority of whom supported Canada and NATO-led forces, through bypassing safe third country agreements to allow Afghans in U.S. detention or facing removal to enter Canada. Canada can expand special immigration measures for Afghan refugees, especially by resuming its visionary private sponsorship program. Instead of border fortresses, Canada can fund humane and knowledgeable border programs based on international legal obligations to welcome asylum seekers fleeing U.S. deportation. Canada can be a better partner to Central and South American countries whose citizens are on the move, but cannot stay in the U.S. To this end, if passed, Canada's Bill C-12 would be detrimental to refugee protection, leaving refugees and asylum seekers even more vulnerable to the U.S. immigration system. Since my first time working in Palestine, I have wondered, how much more does the world expect Palestinian refugees to survive? As recommended locally, Canada should reopen and transform the temporary resident visa program for Gaza. Canada can also open its doors to refugee and displaced students in Gaza through scholarship initiatives. Canada's resumption of aid to UNRWA is welcomed, as is the leadership shown. More is needed, though, as well as pushing back against Israel's ban of 37 aid agencies in Gaza. Conflicts are at record highs, and Gaza and Sudan exemplify the human toll. More than 12 million people have been displaced in Sudan. Globally, 2.5 million refugees will need resettlement this year. I have been privileged to witness the intergenerational gift that resettlement is, not just for refugees, but receiving countries as well. Instead of lowering immigration targets this year, Canada should redouble its refugee admissions targets. Canada must also introduce new mobility pathways for climate displaced people. The Center for Climate and Security, where I serve on the advisory board in DC, notes that over 40% of NATO member states, including Canada, identify climate-driven migration as a key concern in their national security strategies. Since 2016, 250 million people have been internally displaced by climate-related disasters. Despite this, protections are scant, and less than 1% of climate finance goes to fund adaptation in conflict and climate-vulnerable countries. And the outlook for loss and damage finance is even worse. Canada plans to double current military spending to $81 billion, while cutting $2.7 billion in foreign assistance. Instead of slashing budgets, Canada must redouble its foreign assistance and lead partners to do the same. In Davos last month, Prime Minister Mark Carney said, collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortresses. And I couldn't agree more. Canada sits on the board of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage at the UNFCCC and can champion resilience by supporting grants-based rapid community access climate finance to populations increasingly displaced by climate change. Canada, which has championed participation, must now push for the inclusion of refugees, migrants, and displaced persons to meaningfully participate in the UNFCCC's consultative forums to ensure that the fund is responsive to frontline communities. Canada must scale its own pledge of $16 million, far below its obligations as a historic carbon emitter, and mobilize resources through innovative taxes and levies. Many are also fighting for their right to stay. I interviewed dozens of such communities in Guatemala's Dry Corridor region and also in Kenya, who told me their deepest wishes are to be able to afford a life at home, which climate change and rising inequality are making impossible. Scaling and dispersing public climate finance now is integral to decreasing displacement. Canada has an opportunity to fill the U.S. void in international cooperation and lead other countries to follow suit. Long known for its welcoming
policies. Can you wrap it out, please? Time is up.
Sure. Long known for its welcoming policies and pioneering initiatives, Canada can step into a bigger leadership position internationally when it comes to addressing displacement and shaping climate policy, and that time is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tower. Now I would like to invite Dr. Kausar Ahmed to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. Floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to appear before you today. I teach at University of Winnipeg and also lead the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada. And since 2017, we have researched and engaged in policy work on Rohingya forced displacement in Myanmar and Bangladesh. We are currently implementing a Global Affairs Canada funded project titled Charting a Lasting Peace in Myanmar under Indo-Pacific Strategy Programming. Our scholarship and practice focus on South and Southeast Asia, including both internally, externally displaced persons and cross-border refugees. Across contexts, our work aligns with the consistent finding, which is forced displacement is driven primarily by political unrest with escalation into armed conflict, often compounded by military rule, repression, and systemic exclusion. Policy responses to mitigate displacement tend to follow 5 pathways: bilateral arrangements, multilateral coordination, sanctions and other levers, United Nations and regional mediation, and justice and accountability. Each can matter, but each takes time. However, the danger is protracted displacement where the status quo hardens, families languish in camps, and return becomes less feasible with each passing year. Third country resettlement remains vital for protection, especially for the most vulnerable. But it cannot resolve mass displacement. It cannot substitute for addressing political drivers that caused the displacement in the first place. Our current work, therefore, emphasizes that durable solutions require addressing at least one root cause rather than merely managing the symptom. In the Myanmar conflict, which we believe is replicable in other cases, we advanced a 5-pronged approach. First, we identify credible alternatives from indefinite war by mapping the incentives that keep parties fighting and the conditions that could move them towards a peace deal. Secondly, we outline a reconstruction pathway. Conflict destroys institutions and infrastructure, and without an actionable recovery plan, peace becomes a slogan rather than a viable choice. Thirdly, we strengthen regional engagement, particularly through Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN in short. Canada is an ASEAN dialogue partner, and the ASEAN-Canada strategic partnership can create and will create opportunities to support regional conflict diplomacy and implementing peace intervention. Fourthly, we build coalitions of like-minded civil society groups to advocate for conflict resolution in the region and co-create channel of influence. Fifth, we urge to invest in capacity building with the help from diaspora communities among displaced people languishing in the camps where they are now, and link it with the reconstruction pathway so that return, when possible, is sustainable. Here comes the concept of humanitarian diplomacy, which I'm a big advocate of, as it connects protection to development and peace building, reduces long-term dependency, and can create space for dialogue for peace. Finally, what we can do as a country. Canada can further engage its consulates and diplomatic presence in sustained practical capacity building. I'm not saying it is not happening. However, my observation is that these are occurring in piecemeal and not within a broader Canadian approach in dealing with forced displacements and sustainable capacity building for the displaced. 2, we suggest that token resettlement is not a realistic long-term primary solution. Thus, Canada should consider building a framework of humanitarian diplomacy with willing partners like Qatar. The greatest justice you can give to the displaced is a door back to where they belong. Every return, thus, is a defeat for those who drove them out. 3, Canada should intensify engagement with regional powers and ASEAN. In that effort, Canada should also build on working channels in the Canada-China relationship through an issue-based engagement on humanitarian access and reconstruction. 4th, Canada can leverage its civil society and research ecosystem as a peace asset. The Oslo Back Channel and the Aceh peace process show how sustained non-governmental facilitation can open channels, build trust, and support peace implementation. Mr. Chair, my core message is this: humanitarian assistance is essential, but it is not a substitute for political and development strategy for internally and externally displaced persons, particularly in the case of Rohingyas. If Canada wants
If
fewer
you can wrap it
protracted
out, please.
crises
Time is out if you could finish.
and fewer generations stranded in limbo, our policy must match compassion with sustained conflict resolution capacity at the root of the conflict. Thank you once again, and I welcome any further questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kausar. Now I'd like to invite Madame Anne-Catherine Schaefer to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Chair, honourable members, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, is the United Nations systems agency dedicated to migration. We work closely with governments, partners worldwide to save lives, reduce vulnerabilities, and support practical solutions for internally and externally displaced persons and the communities that host them. At the outset, allow me to note that IOM's intervention here today is provided on a voluntary basis. Displacement today is both unprecedented in scale and changing in character. At the end of 2024, 83.4 million people were living in internal displacement across 117 countries, the highest level recorded. Nearly 45% of those displaced by conflict and violence were in just 2 countries, Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Displacement has become increasingly protracted. Across major crises, nearly half of internally displaced persons have remained displaced for more than 5 years, generating profound human, social, and economic consequences for affected states and communities. Protracted displacement reshapes demographics, deepens socioeconomic fragility, and places sustained pressure on public services, often in regions that are already vulnerable. Evidence consistently shows that areas affected by internal displacement experience lower income levels, reduced educational attainment, and shorter life expectancy. Children represent a growing share of displaced populations, increasing from 28% in 2018 to 40% in 2024. These trends highlight a critical reality. Solutions must be designed from the onset of a crisis, grounded in lived realities of displaced populations rather than constrained by short-term emergency cycles. Root causes of internal displacement are converging. Conflict and violence remain the primary drivers, while climate and disaster-related hazards increasingly act as risk multipliers, and most IDPs displaced by conflicts live in countries with high or very high climate vulnerability. Fragile governance, economic contraction, and services collapse, which deepen the pressure that force people to move or prevent them from rebuilding their lives. Understanding and addressing internal displacement depends fundamentally on robust and interoperable data systems to inform evidence-based interventions. IOM's Displacement Tracking Matrix, the DTM, represents the world's largest source of primary data on displacement. Active in more than 90 countries, it delivers thousands of assessments each year, tracking population movements, locations, vulnerabilities, access to services, housing conditions, protection risks, and future intentions. This evidence base enables the global community to develop solutions that are tailored to needs, localized, and focus on highest needs populations, or, as presented in the Global Humanitarian Overview, hyper-prioritized populations. Complementing this operational data, IOM's Progress Report and Global Profiles for Internal Displacements analyze displacement environments over time. For example, IOM's last report highlighted that a clear majority, approximately 60%, of internally displaced persons expressed the intention to remain and pursue solutions through local integration. However, they consistently face barriers in doing so. These tools help identify the structural barriers to solutions, including inadequate housing, limited livelihood opportunities, lack of documentation, and persistent safety constraints. Together, these systems enable governments and the United Nations to cost, sequence, and monitor solutions and strategies, helping shift displacement responses from reactive crisis management towards measurable, nationally led long-term solutions. When national protection systems are overwhelmed and safe options within countries are limited, people cross borders in search of safety. External displacement, people crossing an international border in search of safety, remains a distinct yet interconnected phenomenon from internal displacement. Unlike IDPs, who remain under the authority and responsibility of their own government, externally displaced people require international protection frameworks, asylum systems, and cross-border coordination. Resettlement remains one of the most durable and impactful solutions for people facing protracted displacement. It is a protection tool that offers safety and stability to refugees who cannot return home, and it also contributes to global solidarity at a time when needs are rising. It is also important to note that risks along major migratory routes are acute. Since 2014, IOM's Missing Migrant Project has recorded more than 80,000 deaths and disappearances, with over 3/4 occurring in crisis-affected countries, underscoring how conflict, disasters, and state fragility push people into dangerous cross-border movements. As a system, we strive to move beyond displacement management to focus on resources on solutions. With coherent and sustained support, countries can translate policy commitments into measurable outcomes, ensuring that solutions are safe, voluntary, and dignified. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Schaefer. Now I would like to invite Madam Ndeye Dienaba Ndiaye.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour.
Hello, Chair. Hello, members. Thank you for the invitation to come and present some of what my organization, the Observatory on Migrants and Asylum Seekers, does. Our headquarters is in Montreal. Migratory movements are part of humanity. Wars, conflicts, social inequality, poverty, climate change, severe human rights violations, such as violence against women, gender-based violence, and rape, lead women, men, and children to choose migration. However, a number of people live in countries other than their country of origin. So we're talking about only 3.6% of the world population that lives in a country other than their country of origin. Africa is the cradle of humanity, and there have been massive displacements of people from Africa to other continents over millions of years. Migration is an ancestral practice that has taken a number of forms. Then we know as well that in the 19th century there was a strong emigration of Europeans. Paul Rivet tells us that in 1911 there were 5 million or more Italians abroad. In 1921, the Canadian population was made up of people from England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. So we know that there have been massive displacements from the east as well toward the west since the First War of Indochina, the Vietnam War as well. And so all of this is part of the history of humanity, and immigration is a social phenomenon. So really, migration is subject to a certain hierarchy, where people from the global north have an easier time than people from the global south. And there has to be a way of ensuring a freedom of circulation for people throughout the world in a way that is not hierarchical. So some of the considerations that we have to take into account is that it is important to have a functional migration system, but it is not realistic because the migrant situation is seen as static and not something that develops. So what has to be taken into account is that the non-linear nature of migration trajectories should lead to a revision of our migration policies in order to rise to the current challenges. Temporary migration provides some solutions in the short term and medium term, but the desired solution should be over at least 10 years and integrate needs that are based on demographics, the economy, and services offered in host societies. As we know, before the 90s, migration was circular. And it was mainly legal as well because it was facilitated by migratory policies that were diverse and inclusive. If we look back at history, we can see that there is a link between the closure of borders and irregular migration, which we saw in the 2018 Marrakesh Pact with regard to migration, because there was an attempt to circumscribe irregular migration. And Canada and other countries face a number of challenges that are linked to migration and that create challenges and debate over the problems caused by migration. The crisis in 2018 that was centered around the Canadian and U.S. border led to a kind of revival of solutions that would make it possible to ensure that people could be supported over longer times. And it led to the need, or rather to realizing that there was a need for greater collaboration between federal and provincial governments, for example. There's also a situation now globally where the management of migratory flows is transferred into third countries, closer to the borders where there is an outflow of populations. I will end very quickly. So the practice of externalization of the management of migration, well, there are examples in the document I submitted. It means that Canada is in Africa and intervenes there to prevent asylum seekers from getting to Canada. In conclusion, I will say that I am available to answer your questions, and I know also that climate, refugees, and migration has already been addressed by one of my colleagues on the witness panel. Great, thank you. Now we will start the rounds of questions, and I would like to ask Mr. Majendar to take the floor for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you very much to our panelists describing a very difficult challenge of forced displacement and mass displacement. Dr. Wilf, I'll start with you. The story of communism and colonial uprisings over the last 70 years resulted in regimes on how to deal with the question of refugees. Two principal regimes emerged, one of which is specialized for one group of people in the world. In your excellent testimony, you described how Jewish displacement over the same period resulted in migration pressures that we now have to deal with today as anti-Zionism. So let me ask you this, if I might, Dr. Wilf. In the context of the international regimes that are governing how refugees are dealt with and try and bring resolution to the disputes around ill-defined borders, what's your assessment of these two regimes, and how would you suggest the world can focus on building a long-term peace?
So you unmute yourself, please.
Yes, certainly. Essentially, after World War II, when the world organized itself to deal with the massive refugee issues that were taking place, and broadly speaking, and this is still in many ways the case, many of the refugee situations, certainly after World War II, were the direct result of the fall of empires, the end of various empires and colonial rules, and the rise of nation states when lucky, when they were less lucky. Their borders were not through a process of self-determination, but through colonial drawing. Basically, through the creation of those new borders, tens of millions of people became refugees. And generally, all of them got the message that even though they might have lost homes and livelihood, they are expected to move on and to settle in wherever they have settled. So in the new places, the new countries, maybe third countries. But the main message to refugees, the one that actually created a world of peace, was that it's tough, it's tragic, but you move on. And the Refugee Convention was based on these ideas that ultimately people can and should be resettled. There's no right for people to go back home as such. And ultimately what matters is that individuals will find protection in new countries rather than reclaim a particular home. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees is essentially charged with carrying out that form, and that is the smart and successful form of refugee settlement. The one that is basically bizarre is one that was established by UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. It was not bizarre to begin with. It was established as a temporary mechanism, it still is, in order to settle both the Arab and Jewish refugees from the War of 1948. The Jewish refugees that were ethnically cleansed from Jerusalem, from Gaza, were settled by Israel. The Jews that were ethnically cleansed from Judea and Samaria were settled by Israel. But the Arab refugees, who were supposed to be settled within 18 months by UNRWA, and even though they got citizenship by the Kingdom of Jordan, essentially hijacked UNRWA and took it over to ensure that they are not settled, because they understood, as was the message in the world, that settling refugees is the way that you end wars. And they understood that if the Arab refugees from the war that they just waged with the declared purpose that they declared to ensure that the Jews have no sovereignty anywhere in the land, that means that they will have to admit that they were defeated in the war in their goal of preventing Jewish statehood, and they will have to live with the idea of a Jewish state, the idea that they found shameful and unacceptable. UNRWA remains today, after 76 years, still a temporary hijacked organization that abides by its own invented rules that are not the international regimes. As a result, you have a bizarre situation that people who have received Canadian citizenship, one of the most coveted citizenships in the world, remain registered as Palestine refugees by UNRWA, even though for all other refugees in the world, if you become a Canadian citizenship, the UN High Commissioner for Refugee is thrilled to remove you from the refugee list and to basically list you as having found a home. UNRWA has basically maintained itself as an organization for the purpose of perpetuating an endless intergenerational refugee registration, even though by every international standard, they're not refugees. They're either Jordanian citizens who were born in Jordan, they live in Gaza and under the Palestinian Authority, so even by their own telling, they live in Palestine, so they can't be Palestine refugees and live in Palestine. So, and some of them, as I said, had Canadian citizenship. So UNRWA is a unique regime that actually hijacks and uses the words refugees for people who by any proper international standard are not refugees. They're citizens, many of them middle class, wealthy. They enjoy the citizenship of some of the best countries in the world. And yet for the political purposes, they've hijacked a refugee regime to continue a war against Jewish sovereignty.
Which might explain why the German chancellor recently decided to no longer fund UNRWA. David Smolensky, in my last question, in very brief time for you, Secretary Rubio had testified how regimes in Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran used forced displacement of people to hide their operatives. Very briefly, if you have a minute, please provide your views on how that is executed.
Quickly, please, because time is over. Quickly, please.
Thank you for the question. I think one of the most important information that was gathered after the military operation on January 3rd that ended with the capture of Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores is that was proven that Cubans are in Venezuela and not exactly on attending people that are suffering from the humanitarian crisis, but protecting a dictator. 32 agents from Cuba were killed during that operation. And also we have learned that during 26 years, Venezuela sent an estimated $63 billion in oil in exchange for such a sophisticated repressive apparatus that, according to victims and dissidents, Cuban agents have participated.
Please, we exceed 1 minute. Try to finish. We exceed one.
Cuban agents have participated in oppression and persecution. And one of the root causes of having almost 9 million Venezuelans who have fled the country is human rights violations and crimes against humanity.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Now I will Bailey to take the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And I was interested in what Dr. Ahmed said around dealing with long-term displacement and how we deal with the root causes of those displacement and off-ramps. If you want to add anything else to your testimony with respect to what you haven't already said, now's the time. And just brief, please, because I have a number of questions.
Thank you. What I intended to explain is that our shortcut approach of dealing with mass displacement is humanitarian approach, which is absolutely needed, and at some point it is possibly the only thing we can do. But we often neglect the idea, the scheme of dealing with the conflict where it originated. The case study that we are now running, funded by Global Affairs Canada generously, is exactly trying to find out what model we can really come up with. We are midway of the project, and there are a series of discussions that we have had in Bangladesh, the largest host of the refugees in that part of the world. And in April, May, we are going to ASEAN region just to shape up this model of intervention so that conflict can be addressed right in the root. Because with whatever dialogue we have had with Rohingyas, all of them wanted to go back. They don't want to come to Canada, mostly. Thank you.
Yeah, and I've seen that. I've actually visited Cox's Bazar and the Rohingya refugees and saw exactly what you said, that the Rohingya did want to go back to their homeland and to return to their homeland, which is the hope of each and every refugee from those that I've spoken with. I'd like to turn to Ms. Schaefer, and we're talking about the Middle East and Palestinians too in this testimony. If you can just highlight, I know that you're a UN agency which was born out of the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II, and the UN system and the law, the international law that was born out of such darkness is really what guides us today. If you can just explain to us the importance of UNRWA and how that actually plays a critical role in the lives of refugees, Palestinian refugees.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So just to clarify, so IOM is the UN Systems Migration Agency, but we are a member state-driven institution. So Canada being a member state, so we're not a fund or a program and not directly.
I'm aware.
Okay.
I'm aware. I'm just asking as somebody who's involved in the UN system to elaborate a bit upon that.
So, yeah, I mean, while it is well understood that the overall mandate of UNRWA has greatly expanded over the last years, there is currently no alternative to UNRWA as an agency that provides continuous life-saving assistance to people who are in continuous need. The humanitarian situation overall in OPT remains extraordinarily precarious. It's still very, very challenging to get life-saving assistance into the country and to the people in need, whether that is in the entire territory. And there is no alternative currently to UNRWA to be able to support this. This is really the short answer.
If I can ask also follow-up, in terms of, we're talking about externally and internally displaced people. So we just heard about the Rohingya, the example of the Rohingya that are externally displaced. And within Gaza, Palestine, people are being internally displaced. To your knowledge, how many times have residents within Gaza been internally displaced? You might not have an exact answer, but multiple times, is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And are you familiar with what's happening in the West Bank right now?
To the extent that that is possible.
Okay. What's happening with respect to coercion of people, settler violence in the West Bank, and how is that impacting patterns.
That is
of
not going to be
migration.
possible for me to answer. That's,
I understand,
it's,
and I
yeah, it's
respect
better
that.
to ask someone who is a specialized
respect
agency
that.
in that. Thanks.
I wanted to go to an earlier witness, Ms. Tower. You spoke about the program that Canada has to welcome those who are going through horror within Gaza, including students, and the other program that we have to reunite loved ones who are in such dire conditions. Do you want to elaborate any more upon that? Those 2 points, the students and the general program.
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question. I can tell you that I'm not a specialist on Canadian immigration because I have done the vast majority of my resettlement work with UNHCR and then with the U.S. State Department's refugee program, which is currently being gutted. So I look to Canada and the hemispheric border and partnerships and a very strong and robust resettlement and immigration system that Canada has always had. When I was at UNHCR, maybe you won't be surprised at all to hear this, sir, but the amount of refugees that would actually ask to be resettled to Canada versus the United States. And I would always broke my heart to say I have so much fewer slots and opportunities for people to be considered in Canada than the US. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but I add that from my own experiences to share with you that now is the time to create more opportunities for people who have no durable solutions for both the extent of how displaced numbers keep growing, the continuous narrowing of political cooperation, the absolute dismantling of multilateralism, international law, and the financial architecture that underpins humanitarian and development assistance. And to this, I add the climate crisis and how that underpins and just inflames every single thing that we already know that that is driving displacement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I'd like to ask Dr. Wilf, do you believe that Palestinian people exist?
Unmute yourself, please.
I said, of course, if they do. That is a very odd question. The tragedy, of course, is that the ideology around which they constructed themselves as a collective is tragically an ideology of destruction that has for a century prioritized
on that point about destruction.
Destroying.
On the point
Yes.
about destruction, do you believe that there's a humanitarian crisis right now happening in Gaza? I know that you were a former Israeli elected official in the Knesset, but do you currently believe that there's a humanitarian crisis within Gaza?
It's not a matter of belief at the moment.
I'm not sure if maybe my microphone wasn't working properly, but is there a humanitarian crisis right now in Gaza, in your opinion?
Right now, there are thousands of trucks entering Gaza every day to areas under enemy control.
Just to be clear, I'm not sure if you heard, but I know like my mic, when it goes red, it usually should work properly. Is there a humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Point on, Mr. President.
Point of order, Chair.
Entering Gaza every day, above and beyond.
Point on, Mr. President.
Madam, excuse me.
Point of order.
Can you stop just a second, please? Yes.
Juste, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Chair. I just wanted to make sure that we stay polite with witnesses. So when you're insinuating that the microphone is not working, I find that it's not quite as serious as we should be. This is a serious topic, serious panel members, and it's obvious that the member's microphone works.
Have a parole that goes with the parliamentarian rules and obligation, and we're all doing that. Yes, continue, please, but a quick answer because we over time.
My answer is that the people of Gaza have invaded invaded Israel, massacred people, launched a terrible war and a global war on the Jewish people. These are now the consequences of war. And I hope that the day that they end their war against Jewish sovereignty is a day that we can finally make peace.
Thank you, Mr. Zubairi.
For the record, we all condemn what
so-
happened on October 7, but also Canada's position is that there is a humanitarian crisis,
Sorry,
and
Mr.
it's sad that we
Zubairi,
didn't
we
hear that
exceed
today.
in 1 minute, sorry. In 1 minute and give Madame Wilf enough time to answer also. I would like to invite je vous invite à prendre la parole pour 7 minutes, monsieur.
Please, you have the floor for 7 minutes, sir. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here for this important study. We will be focusing on displaced persons. Ms. Tower, the question is for you. You talked about the decrease in international assistance, and also you spoke about international law. To what extent does international law protect or not people who are displaced for climate reasons specifically?
Question and a complex answer, unfortunately. Very clearly speaking, the 1951 Refugee Convention provides the framework for who can be protected by international law, and that's specifically for people who have crossed an international border. And once you have crossed an international border and you're seeking asylum, you have 5 bases under which you can do this, and those are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. In 1951, when the convention was formed, it did not have the rigors of climate change driving it. In 1967, when the convention was amended, it represents the breakdown of colonial pasts and the birth of new countries and a rise in intra and interstate conflict and violence. It's why we have seen that in 1951, originally the convention was only had a geographic limitation and a temporal limitation. That geographic limitation was for people fleeing World War II and Europeans only fleeing, or people fleeing Europe, to be more accurate. The temporal limitation was that it shouldn't have existed this long, and yet here we are. And that is a representation of what I mentioned in 1967 and so many more other crises. Now, that said, in 2020 and 2021, UNHCR, who have the mandate under the 1951 Convention to protect people displaced across international boundaries, did put out 2 legal considerations, 2 papers, if you will, that state that the convention can apply to people who are very, very sort of simply put, sir, whose protection and asylum needs, persecution on the basis of those 5 grounds are increased or further or worsened by the climate crisis. A great example is to say, if you are already marginalized on the basis of your ethnicity, you are an ethnic minority in your country, you don't have the political power to really have more democratic representation, you then face all kinds of marginality that affect your civil and political rights, and you can say you're persecuted on that basis. When the climate crisis hits and your place in the country sees less aid, for example, or is more acute to the vulnerabilities of the climate crisis because you are politically marginalized and therefore economically deprived, et cetera, that can put you at greater harm. And then you can talk about what we kind of consider a nexus ground of why you are further, shall we say, persecuted. Those are my words. That's not really a legal or appropriate way to say it, but it's how I tend to hear people describe how the climate crisis affects them on the basis of their political or civil or, on the basis of their ethnic marginalization. I hope that answers the question. I'm happy to elaborate.
Oui, vous l'avez très bien.
Yes, you did answer the question very well. Now, are you saying, and now we're just discussing it, but there might be a possibility or a proposal that would be necessary to amend the convention to include climate refugees? I think that if I've understood correctly, it would be far simpler and that would create additional protection. There would be, therefore, an international institutionalization of protection for climate refugees if we could amend the convention. I realize that that in itself is not easy to do, but is that a proposal that would make sense, according to you?
Well, first I should say what I said in my opening statement, that based on what we know the vast cases of people displaced as a result of the climate crisis tend to be displaced within their own countries. Now, I want to caveat that with several things. One, that is all we know because we're quite limited in learning about people displaced by the climate crisis when they move across borders. And there are a number of reasons for that as well. One very logical one is if you were to ask somebody, was the climate, crisis a factor, it might actually weaken their protection needs rather than actually strengthen it because of what I already pointed out are the limitations of the convention. There's also the very logical, another logical point that not everybody who's displaced even is afforded the opportunity of such an in-depth interview. Secondly, the border and visa regimes and the militarizations of borders and the externalization of borders that another colleague that's there in the chamber tried to speak about greatly limits how people can move. It's why you might also see that 70 to 80% of the globally displaced in the world live in neighboring countries, because it is extremely difficult, impossible, and very expensive to actually move across international borders. So while the global north shores up its borders and builds fortresses, it's actually not representative of the data of that people actually are more on the move in the global south. Lastly, I want to say, if we were to reopen the convention today to include a wider definition for climate, as you posed in your question, I think the sentiment of anti-migration and also the fact that although there are, the vast majority of countries have acceded to the convention, we have a massive problem with upholding its obligations. And so I think if we were to open the convention today, you would have less collegiality and cooperation than you did in the early 1950s. So I think the side-by-side bilateral and regional cooperation and partnerships, and there are some I can speak to if we have time, is right now a better step in the right direction.
Tout à fait, merci pour ça. On le dit.
Absolutely, thank you. And we often hear that climate refugees often come from countries that are far less responsible for the climate crisis than, for example, the wealthier countries. You talked about Canada's role in your initial remarks, and is there anything else that Canada could do? Canada right now is one of the biggest oil exporters in the world. And now, with the current government that wants to develop more and more oil and gas projects and produce more and more oil, don't you think that it's the role of a country like Canada to invest massively in clean energy, so that someday the climate crisis can stop being a crisis, and so that will be fewer climate refugees down the road?
I have 1 minute. Okay, I couldn't agree more. The greatest intervention any country can take right now is to ameliorate the climate crisis by mitigating and lowering its emissions. A handful of countries, and we're talking about 8 historic carbon emitters here, really have the vast amount of responsibility to quite honestly save the planet and preceding generations. So the biggest effort that Canada can make is to change its global economy to one that isn't fossil fuel dependent, and that is the greatest sign of leadership and gift you can give the most marginalized people on the planet. That is a measure of climate justice, and it also needs to begin at home, to First Nations people, to ethnic minorities, to immigrants who are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, even in global north countries. Historically, Black and disenfranchised and Indigenous people right here in the United States. I'm talking to you from New York. The blizzard has not allowed me to be there in person, but I can tell you domestically and across borders, this is a massive crisis of justice.
Thank you. Ms. Dillon, to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. I will start with Mrs. Amali. So with everything going on in the world today, and you mentioned that there has been a certain level of uprooting of aid organizations and international law. And we are actually disturbingly seeing this increasingly happening. Something I think most people did not expect to see happening, this kind of dismantling. It's beyond, especially with a need that we're seeing more and more. There is more and more displacement. You mentioned there are 117 million people displaced. We've heard previous testimony as well that this number is going to increase. Maybe we could start first with what do you foresee in the future in terms of those who are displaced both internally and externally? What does the future look like for them?
Thank you for that question. It's a really good one because I think often we talk about things in terms of numbers, the data, and I think we have enough science to tell us too that the larger the data, the more honestly insensitive we become because we're not able to actually comprehend. So let me tell you what it's like to work for over 20 years with refugees and forcibly displaced people. The vast majority of, well, you know what, before I say that, let me say this to you. We've talked a bit about resettlement. Would it surprise you to know that you're not even considered for resettlement as a durable solution unless you have reached what's called at least 10 years of displacement? So can you imagine living in a refugee camp for 10 years and less than 1% of the people in the world are even resettled? That number has diminished greatly since 2017 and onwards. That's why I gave the example earlier about how many refugees wanted to go to Canada, but the slots were so few, right? The need is massive. And to what my other colleagues said too, resettlement is a durable solution. That's UNHCR's words, but it is by no means the solution that we should be pursuing as nation states. It is the obliteration of war. If we have so much money for militarism, and for invading countries and subjugating people, we have a problem that is probably more a matter of the soul and the heart. And I think we have to really look at how do we respect fellow human beings? Why do we live in a system, a multilateral one, and even international law that governs how people can live, and that we say it's okay to have an infrastructure and a system that allows people to spend the rest of their lives and the foreseeable generations of their descendants to live in exile from their home? I will just lastly say to you that I have yet to meet anybody who didn't want to either stay in their country or return home to their country. This global north narrative of everybody wants to come to our countries is a fallacy I have yet to experience.
I thank you for saying that, because previous witnesses have also said there's nobody who wants to leave their home, their community, their loved ones, everything they've ever known their entire life. So this is what we're hearing over and over. It's not by choice that they come or they want to live in a refugee camp for 10 years. I will tell you, I did not know that this was one of the strict conditions. So as opposed to, I think another witness said that the conditions are not strict enough, it doesn't get any worse than this. You have to be a refugee for 10 years or displaced before you're considered for any sort of concrete solution to your problem. And this is entire families who are suffering this way. And you mentioned also that invading and committing cruelty on each other, it's more a problem of, I would say, morality from the way you testified. Can you talk to us about that and how women and children are affected by everything that is decided, whether it's politically or through climate? Please. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, please.
And
I have to ask you a quick answer also. Time is up.
Sure. Just to say too that it's at least 10 years that someone would even come up for resettlement. So it's multiple decades. Okay. But women and children are by far the most affected, vulnerable. What I find is if it weren't for women, you know, the meager food aid and programs that are extended to refugees, it wouldn't even have the weight of impact if it weren't for women. Water in camps, you know, it's girls who go to fetch that. And think about that in the era of the climate crisis. I have met refugee girls and refugee women and people internally displaced as well who now have to choose between education or going to fetch water because it takes 7 hours to go find water. And you're doing this under extreme heat. I've also met people in Kenya who have died and capsized under water holes that they continue to dig because they've run dry. And it's almost always girls. So when we talk about sustainable development goals and how we want to empower and eradicate, illiteracy and educate women and girls, we're actually seeing setbacks. That's what the climate crisis looks like for displaced people.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Madame Krones to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for sharing your experiences and your perspectives on this important issue. We have heard universally that displacement in the world is growing, and there really are, but I'd like to pick it apart a little bit in terms of the two main sources of it, because whether displacement is internal or external, these days it's a combination in some cases of the concept of forced displacement, which is sort of the involuntary movement of people, but there's also a more invidious form of displacement that has been occurring in terms of strategic depopulation, where in some cases it is not actually clear who the actor is that is the sort of instigator of it. But nonetheless, it is a tactic that is often used indiscriminately to intentionally empty a geographic area for one reason or another. And so, Mr. Smolanski, I was hoping that you might talk a little bit or expand a little bit, because I think you hinted at this in your opening remarks, about the potential political impacts of this kind of displacement on things like voter eligibility or participation in key electoral districts. I suspect you've experienced this and have some knowledge of it happening in Venezuela.
Sure. Thank you. Well, what I can say regarding voting eligibility is that at least in the case of Venezuela, Venezuelan migrants and refugees have been illegally banned for voting. We have not been eligible for vote for more than a decade. It is estimated that approximately 5 million out of the 9 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees could vote because they are over 18 years old, which is what the Constitution says. And we have not been able to do it. So this is a political discrimination. And if I may add, not only we are suffering from a violation of our political rights, in this case to vote, but at the same time, one of the tragedies that we are facing more and more is our right of our identity. Millions of Venezuelans, it is difficult to estimate today, don't have a passport or have an expired passport. So they have restrictions of mobility. And I don't want to put this on my on first person, but let me just share my story. I've been banned life. I have a legal ban life for public service in Venezuela. I was mayor and I was illegally removed from office, forced to be in hiding for 35 days until I fled my country disguised as a priest until I got to Brazil. I've been in exile for 9 years and my passport is expired since 2019. I don't have any possibility to renew my passport due to political reasons. But I have the opportunity in front of this parliament and in front of this witness to share my story. But this is the story of millions of Venezuelans. So this is something that, as I said in my remarks, if we want to have a truly restoration of democracy and freedom in Venezuela, well, we need that what started in July 2024 with the elections and with people voting on a free and fair elections.
I believe we're in Canada when the sort of most recent episode in Venezuela's political history occurred. And I'm wondering if you might comment on the role that disinformation played in your own experiences and in Venezuela's situation, and how it benefits actors in international relations who may not want the best outcome for countries in terms of democracy.
Well, the role of misinformation in Venezuela, it's huge. It is the regime has a very strong propaganda apparatus, with the support of non-democratic external actors, such as China. There are different reports on how Chinese technology has helped Venezuela's regime not only to expand propaganda, but at the same time, censorship. So, for example, Venezuelans in Venezuela, if they don't have a VPN, they cannot access to X or Twitter. They don't have access to independent media. So they have to use a VPN. So it has become a very important issue and concerning one. And this started 16 years ago when just Twitter was starting. Hugo Chavez created what he called the communications guerrilla. And these are thousands and thousands and thousands of users in X that now are bigger with trolls and bots, that they are attacking and threatening anyone who thinks differently from the regime every single day. By the way, I have to add something that regarding expired passport, I have to be grateful with Canada, which is one of the few countries
quickly,
yes,
please.
I just have to say that Canada is one of the few countries that allows Venezuelan expired passport.
Thank you, Ms. Clanes. And now j'aimerais inviter Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe.
Now I'd like to invite Mr. Brunet-Duceppe to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Schaefer? Yes, I'll let you put your earpiece on. So here, we're talking about displaced persons, and often when we talk about a displaced person, we're talking about externally displaced persons, but there are many internally displaced persons in conflict areas. And what are the challenges, the major challenges, operationally speaking, when it comes to meeting the needs of internally displaced persons in a conflict situation?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So operational challenges to respond to people who are internally displaced in conflict situations is quite different from natural disasters, even though the two cannot really be delinked. In the majority of cases, especially today, like we were looking at Sudan, Somalia, or Mozambique, we are having an overlap of both natural disasters and conflict drivers. The majority of the challenges are either directly linked to political will, funding, and availability of local opportunities. The Secretary General has started or implemented something that's called the Solutions Agenda. Canada was the champion 2025. And in this Solutions Agenda, the entire system, the humanitarian architecture, is trying to pivot towards so-called solutions for internal displacement, where locally led, internationally supported policies are created in order to support local integration, to support communities to absorb the number of people that have been displaced. And in the countries that we're mostly dealing with, say Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have a huge number of internally displaced that are not able to be absorbed simply because the local system is unable to deal with such a shock, because it is a weak system to begin with. The absence of long-term funding through, for example, the international development banks is one of the main continuous drivers. And of course, we need strong local governments that are able to to lead that development, to not have a situation where we create aid dependency or situations where an international team is dictating how local solutions should look. This should be a locally driven and a locally owned process that is primarily implemented by local governments and local communities.
À ce moment-là, quand on regarde ce qui est en train de se
So
passer,
when we see what is happening pretty much everywhere in wealthy countries, where international assistance and development aid is taking a nosedive, well, we can also see it on the part of the Canadian government right now. There has been a fairly drastic cut with regard in development assistance, and a great deal more is being invested in defense. Not just the Canadian government, but many governments are doing that same thing. They are cutting international assistance monies and funneling money into defense. We saw it with USAID, and there's Japan as well that has cut its budget in that way. And so really we're going in the wrong direction, because here we are talking about displaced persons, and Canada really is doing the opposite of what it should be doing.
Yes, I mean the international funding landscape for humanitarian assistance right now is dire. I mean, we don't have to sugarcoat that. I think this is the reality that we live in. But I think this is why it is more and more important to ensure that when we're talking about humanitarian assistance, we do not limit humanitarian assistance to life-saving assistance, but that we pivot from the onset. We call it solutions from the start, towards systems where we can ensure that people can try to get empowered and self-reliant as quickly as possible without needing the continuous assistance through humanitarian aid. That can start, it's very simple. You can start with handing out a tent, or you can start by building a temporary shelter that can be transferred or converted into a more permanent shelter. If you start with a tent and if you start in a camp, it is much more difficult to pivot than if you start with local absorption capacities and ability to build a shelter that can be transformed into something more permanent. This is how simple it starts.
Merci, Madame Ndiaye.
Thank you, Ms. Ndiaye. You have a significant observatory on international affairs, on refugees and stateless persons. Could you tell the committee about any specific initiatives, if you have examples, that could be a significant initiative internationally? So do you have any specific examples that could be used as a model, a working model? Yes, thank you. So, yes, it's particularly necessary because international law is having difficulty meeting the challenges of the moment. So there's the Norwegian model, for example. The Norwegian model works. It's not perfect, perhaps, but it works because it makes it possible for the migrant population to gradually settle through migration policies. And if people want to return home, well, it makes it possible as well. And Canada could do that, but it would be necessary for Canada to redefine its migration policy or immigration policy based on needs and everything that is going on around Canada, the crises, the conflicts, and the wars that makes people leave their homes. Because we see it in our research. There are people who are leaving Senegal, go through Nicaragua, and then go through Mexico, and then through the United States to get to Canada. So in Europe, there are some models that work. In Africa, we can give the example of the CDAO zone, where there is a free circulation area according to law. However, on the ground, there are many challenges. So we often encourage Canada to develop partnerships with populations that are struggling with these challenges, so that the diaspora in Canada can be involved in co-developing solutions. The diaspora contributes more than 3/4 of development assistance. So there is a lack of balance, and it's getting worse, and contributions are important, and so is the expertise and the skills that they can contribute. Yes, I'll let you go on for an extra 2 minutes because it was the first time that you had received a question. Thank you.
Vandenberg to take the floor for 5 minutes. Welcome, Anita.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask I have a number of questions. My first question of Mr. Smolansky. You said something that I think is quite telling, and it was about the fact that more so than war, more so than natural disaster, erosion of democracy is a driver of migration, and particularly, obviously, in Venezuela, lack of civic space, lack of freedom, lack of rule of law. I wonder, also what you said about return, and that having those democratic freedoms is really one of the conditions people look to before they're able to return. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and specifically, both in the way that the lack of democracy is what drives people to leave, but also what the conditions would be for return in that regard.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, for us, that has been our main lesson, especially because Venezuela during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was a country that received at least 4 million migrants, not only from Latin America, but also from Europe, like my family. So as we are right now, hundreds of Venezuelans are still fleeing the country daily. As I said, since the last presidential election, almost a bit more than 600,000 Venezuelans have fled, and we estimate that this might be the largest outflow due to political reasons. There is hope right now that democracy could be restored in the near future, but until it's not restored, people do not feel safe to go back. As I said in my remarks, there is a so-called amnesty law right now discussed in Venezuela, and the president of the National Assembly, which is an illegitimate National Assembly, said that Venezuelans who have requested asylum and refuge will not be included in this so-called amnesty law. So it is concerning that you are having almost 1 million Venezuelans who have already being recognized as refugees or are waiting for a response for asylum or refugee. If they decide to go back because maybe things could be getting better, they will not be protected. So in that regard, their integrity could be in risk, and they could be illegally detained by this regime that, as I said, have detained illegally more than 20,000 innocents during the last decade.
Thank you very, very much. And I know that, Dr. Ahmed, you talked about something similar about conditions of return. Can you elaborate a bit with regard to the Rohingya?
Thank you very much for the question. Conditions of return of Rohingyas are incumbent on the safety, dignity. These are the two primary conditions. However, as we know, Rohingyas are stateless people. They were made stateless intentionally by the state of Myanmar starting from 1982. So whenever we talk about their safe repatriation with dignity, we have to really mind ourselves that what about their legality when they go back? Will they be the regular citizen of Myanmar? As we also know that in the International Court of Justice, the case was launched in 2020, and just end of last year, the case was actually heard again in terms of giving a verdict. And this question again came up, that how to deal with the identity of Rohingyas, because from the beginning, the state of Myanmar consistently denied the identity of Rohingyas as Rohingyas. And as you also know, some of you might be that once they have crossed the border, when they're hosted in Bangladesh, the Bangladeshis also technically do not recognize or acknowledge them as Rohingyas. They officially say forcibly displaced Myanmar national, FDMN. So I think this aspect of citizenship is super critical for Rohingyas in terms of their repatriation. However, from our side, research and advocacy, what we say that the conditions should be enabled with the discussions of the state of Myanmar, and also now additional layers started, as again, many of you might know, ethnic armed organizations, especially Arakan Army operating in that area. So this discussion has not yet taken place to the best of our knowledge, but this ought to be done.
Thank you very much. Ms. Schaefer, you talked about the amount of time that the longer the time goes by, the more difficult it is to return. And I think you said half of displaced people right now have been displaced for more than 5 years. Can you talk about how to, first of all, prevent that long-term displacement and a little bit also on the conditions of return?
A quick answer, please, because time is out.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, as I mentioned, I think the one pathway that we have as an international community is that we invest heavier from the beginning in these solutions from the start, in order to enable this this environment in which people do not need to remain displaced extensively. Happy to elaborate later. Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. And now I would like to invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And let me start with Mr. Smolansky. Let me ask you, sir, you were talking a little bit about how authoritarian regimes work through Venezuela and others in Cuba, Iran, Russia. I wanted to give you a chance to unpack that idea just a bit further, if you wish.
Thank you. In the case of Venezuela, we have seen the presence of non-democratic external actors, which I would mention Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China. In the case of Cuba, as I was describing in the first question, it was proven on January 3rd that the protection of Maduro depends on foreign agents, in this case, Cubans, and it is estimated that almost 20,000 Cubans have been around Venezuela since 1999. I was describing that approximately $63 billion have been given to Cuba. That is not free, because in exchange, they have provided a very sophisticated repressive apparatus that, according to the reports from the UN fact-finding mission, victims and dissidents have said that Cuban agents have participated and advised on repression and persecution and torture to innocent Venezuelans. In the case of China, they have provided technology for surveillance and social control and repression, especially in the protests, peacefully and non-violent protests that happened in 2017, where the equipment used was provided by China, and since that year is where the International Criminal Court is investigating crimes against humanity in Venezuela. And also, I have to say that Russia and Iran have become the main arms provider to Venezuela's regime. In the case of Iran, they have provided technology for drones, not only for surveillance, but also war. And at the same time, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard has given capacity building to elite forces in Venezuela to be more sophisticated on its repression and persecution. And in the case of Russia, at least $13 billion have been invested on military equipment. I want to remark on the AK-47. It is estimated that almost 250,000 AK-47 were bought by Chavez and Maduro, and a lot of those AK-47 have been given to not only elite forces but non-state armed groups that in Venezuela are known as colectivos, and they are the ones that are used sometimes to repress, kidnap, and force disappear innocent Venezuelans. So this is an autocracy network that have been heavily executed in Venezuela, and have caused, obviously, this situation, human rights violation, crimes against humanity, people fleeing, looking for opportunities and liberties where they don't have it in Venezuela.
Thank you very much. In my remaining time, Dr. Wilf, you were exposed to remarkably defunct set of assumptions that have informed a logic train that has created a distortion not just of our understanding of displacement in the Middle East, but of Gaza. Would you like to take a few minutes to continue to rebut some of the things that you had been exposed to?
Please unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself.
Certainly. One of the greatest things that needs to be understood is, of course, the role of UNRWA, Orwellian name, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, as actually they try to pretend that they are the firefighter, but they are actually the arsonist. UNRWA actually has tremendous responsibility for the fact that Gazans chose to invest years, billions, in building the infrastructure of tunnels, in planning and executing the invasion into Israel and the massacre. It is UNRWA that essentially allowed the people of Gaza to plan and invest in this. And moreover, it is UNRWA that has allowed the people of Gaza, as well as the Palestinians in the West Bank, to continue to believe that they are legitimized and that they have global support, UN support, and Western support through the funding for the idea that it is legitimate to pursue the destruction of the Jewish state as a goal.
Can you wrap it out, please? We are almost 1 minute out of time. Yes.
I'm sorry?
Can you wrap it out, finish, because we have almost exceeded by 1 minute.
Yes. So ultimately, when people say what will replace UNRWA, it's quite simple. Ultimately, Palestinian responsibility. The day that they finally choose to build for themselves rather than destroy the Jewish state, they will no longer need the money for that terrible goal.
Thank you. Maintenant, j'invite M. Brunel-Duceppe de prendre la parole pour 5 minutes.
I would like to invite Mr. Brunel-Duceppe to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Smolansky, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Welcome to the committee. I will continue in French because that is the official language here, and I must continue in French. Last Monday in Berlin, I met Mr. Leopoldo Lopez, an extraordinary man. We weren't able to chat for very long, but I would like to know what you think and what your understanding of the situation is with regard to the conditions that would be necessary to ensure a voluntary and safe return of displaced Venezuelans.
Thank you for the question. Well, to guarantee a safe return of millions of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, first of all, we need to have a complete restoration of democracy. Second, political rights in the case of political leaders who have been forced to exile need to be guaranteed. Third, we need a country that it's completely free, not partially free. I would also add that we need a nation that needs to guarantee access to justice, which is something that we have lacked for almost 3 decades. And fourth, well, a country where the people who can go back could have access to education, healthcare, and work. I would say that those are the conditions that we need for people to go back. I'm aware that the 9 million Venezuelans will not go back. That's something that has not happened on any other migration outflow or diaspora, but this might be a unique case where you can see 30 or 40% of the population going back if the conditions are improved. But definitely, democracy, freedom, and access to justice, it's something mandatory for that.
Juste pour un peu de contexte,
yes, for a bit of context, can you tell us in which country the largest number of displaced Venezuelans are in, or is it Colombia, or is it in another country?
Colombia right now has approximately 3.7 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, surpassing the Syrians in Turkey. Then there is Peru with 1.7 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, the US 1.3 million, and then you have very similar numbers in Brazil, Ecuador, and Chile, between 500 and 600,000 Venezuelans. That's in regard on the Americas. If you go in Europe, the largest Venezuelan community, it's in Spain, which is estimated between 500 and 600,000 Venezuelans.
Gracias, señor. Madame Schaefer, tantôt Madame Ndiaye.
Mrs. Schaefer, earlier Ms. Ndiaye was talking about the Norwegian model, and we were talking about funding just before that. So I think that Norway is possibly one of the only countries that reach the 0.7% of the GDP for international development assistance required or requested by the UN. I think that Canada is under the 0.3% bar. Would you say that that is an example of the structural situation in Norway with programs that work, and also an example of how a country should act and behave on the international stage upstream from international crises by providing what the UN requires with regard to international assistance?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that Canada should play its role, particularly since Canada is recognized on the world stage as a country that really does care about the rights of migrants, and particularly vulnerable migrants. So I agree that Canada should contribute more in terms of assistance, and also with regard to assistance and making it possible for migrant populations to develop skills and to become more independent as well. Because the objective is not to propose short-term solutions, it is to propose long-term solutions. And that's what happens, for example, with the European Fund to Return Migrants Home, for example. And Canada is starting to do it, but Canada should expand its efforts within its immigration policy and when it comes to international funding for international humanitarian assistance. In recent years, as I mentioned, Canada. I'm sorry. Please. You've gone over time by 40 seconds. It's time to conclude. Yes, I think that Canada should not only provide funding, but should ensure that the funding goes to very, very vulnerable persons, particularly climate refugees. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for the testimony at this meeting for internally and externally displaced persons.
The members, the staff, interpreter, we would like to thank all of our witnesses for your presence here. Your good introduction, good answer to our questions is enlightening this committee. If any one of you would like to contact the subcommittee for additional information, you can write to me as a chair or to the clerk, and we welcome anything from your side. We thank you again, and we wish you the best. And now, meeting is over. Adjourned. Thank you.
you.